Are we all set? Could we begin?
We're good.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the LSA session on control. I'm Ellen Thompson from Florida International University, and I'll be the chair of this session. The structure of the presentations is that each speaker will have 20 minutes, and that will be followed by 10 minutes for questions and answers. So please, if you have questions, use the chat function to ask your question. And if you ask a question, please let us know your name. Thank you. Our first speaker is Irina Budukina. She's from the Research Institute for Linguistics at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And she is going to be speaking with us today about arguments introduced by C heads. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I will start sharing my screen right now, and hopefully you can all see it. And just in case, I will also drop this link to the chat where you can download the handout. Okay, so that's there. Okay, so indeed today I would like to talk about A properties of C heads. And it is already quite well known linguistically that C heads can participate in agreement and case assignment. However, those two phenomena, they involve movement, right? So usually we talk about some arguments that are generated lower in the embedded clause, for example, and then they move to the spec CP. And there is this assumption that spec CP is not actually suitable for external merge. And this is the assumption that I will try to challenge today. So I will try to persuade you that a particular type of C head can actually project an argument in spec CP, and it can assign a thematic role to that argument and probably even case, although I won't have time, unfortunately, to talk about that in much detail. So the data that I will consider come from Middle-Mari. It's a Uralic language spoken in Mariel Republic in Russia. And in particular, I will focus on these object control constructions that involve a speech-act verb. Okay, I keep seeing something in the chat. Apologies for being distracted. So again, object control constructions, Middle-Mari, speech-act verb in the center of them. When a speech-act verb embeds a finite indicative clause, we get this simple utterance. And you can see an example in one. So I can say, Mary told us that the boys had seen the book. This is a simple utterance, right? But when the same speech-act verb, kalasash in this case, tell, embeds a non-finite or a finite subjunctive clause, then we suddenly get this mandative interpretation. So if I say Mary told us to come, right, then we get this order interpretation. And the dative DP that we see here is interpreted not just as a goal of communication, the one Mary was talking to, but simultaneously as a mandee or obligation holder. So the one who is responsible for performing this embedded action, right? And this is quite common for languages across the world. What is interesting about Mari is that in constructions with a metric speech-act verb, and this mandative interpretation, basically an embedded non-finite clause, right? Suddenly two dative DPs can appear, and they're not coordinated, and they have quite different properties. And you can see an example in 3. So I have Masha, me dative, you dative, to come, told. And we have here this optional complementizer manen in the embedded non-finite clause. And this sentence can be interpreted as something like, Masha was talking to me, and she told me for you to come. So the first dative DP that I color-coded blue throughout the handout is essentially the immediate goal of communication, the one Masha was talking to. And the second dative DP, the one color-coded in this greenish, is interpreted as the obligation holder. And it can also be interpreted as this ultimate goal of communication. I will talk about it just a little bit later in more detail. So basically, the implied interpretation here is that I should pass this message on to you, although that is not required. So I can continue this example in 3 by saying something like, Masha told me for you to come, but I didn't tell you about that. So that would be a nice continuation. And these examples are quite rare typologically. What I mean is that they are not attested, for instance, in Russian, which is a contact language. And these double dative constructions cannot be found, let's say, in Hungarian, which is another Uralic language, right? And even in Mari, it is usually prohibited to have 2 datives in a single clause. So let's say we can have dative beneficiary and we can have dative external possessor, but we cannot have 2 datives, a beneficiary and an external possessor in the same clause. And that is out. So the question is how to analyze these constructions. And I propose that what we have here is actually this peculiar case where the first DP dative, the blue one, is just a matrix goal of communication, nothing peculiar about that one. But the second DP dative, the green one, is not an argument of the embedded predicate. It is not an argument of the main predicate, but instead it is base generated in spec CP, and it gets licensed by the embedded C head itself. And my claim is that this embedded C head, manifested in Mari as this complementizer manen, has this exceptional property because it is a semi-grammaticalized functional element. So it is being derived from this verb of communication manash, to say, to tell, and it still retains some of its lexical properties, namely the ability to assign this goal or address C, call it what you want, thematic role to its argument. And unfortunately, I will have to skip some pieces of data, but you can see them in the appendix to the handout. So you can click on these symbols and you can go there immediately. Now let me talk first about this dative DP2 that we see, the one color coded in green, the unexpected one. What are the properties of this dative DP? So on the one hand, it forms a constituent with the embedded non-finite clause. So the two form a unit together. And we can see it because, for example, a matrix adverb, a matrix adjunct cannot intervene between the two, even though adjuncts normally can scramble quite freely within a clause in Mari. And the second point here is that, for example, if you want to dislocate an embedded clause, you can only do that together with this DP dative. So you cannot separate them, basically. So at this point, you can take a look at example like 5, for instance, where these two, the dative DP and the embedded clause, look kind of inseparable. And you can tell me, well, maybe this DP dative is just the subject of the embedded clause, because we know that we can have overt embedded subjects in non-finite clauses, and they are attested again in Russian, a contact language. They are attested in Hungarian, another Uralic language. So why not here in Mari? However, I would like to argue that this DP dative cannot be analyzed as an argument of the embedded predicate. There is no evidence to support such an analysis. And this can be seen in the fact that this DP dative is not selected by the embedded predicate. So it is restricted, but that restriction is there regardless of the kind of the verb, for example, we have in the embedded clause. So first, this DP dative must be plus human. It cannot be inanimate, and it can only be an animal, for instance, if we are talking about some kind of fairy tale context where animals can speak. So let me show you these examples in 6. I can say something like 6b. Masha told me that the cow should come herself. And this sentence is okay. It's something like Masha told me not to bother about it. Basically, Masha ordered me for the cow to come herself. She told me, let her come herself. This is fine. This is a proper grammatical sentence. But here we have embedded subjunctive clause with a nominative subject cow. If I try to substitute this subjunctive clause with a nominative cow, with a combination cow dative plus non-finite clause, then the sentence is ungrammatical, and it can no longer have this interpretation, Masha told me that the cow should come herself. So this is out. And the speakers actually all start laughing here and say something like, oh, she told me to go and talk to the cow, how funny that is. And more importantly, DP dative is further restricted. It not only has to be plus human, it also must be this active human, the one who is good as this goal of communication as an addressee. So consider this scenario, for instance. The children are asleep and they should sleep until the evening. So it wouldn't make sense for me to go and talk to these children because they are already sleeping, right? And let's say the doctor talked to me and asked me to check on them to make sure that they would sleep until the evening. So in this case, I can say something like 7a. This is felicitous. So I can say the doctor told me that the children should sleep until the evening. Here we have embedded subjunctive clause, right? Everything is fine. But it would be infelicitous to say something like 7b, where we have children DP dative and we have embedded non-finite clause. This example would be inappropriate in such scenario because the children are already sleeping, right? I cannot go and talk to them. So we have the same restriction as we have for normal goals of communication in single dative constructions. So compare the 7b, for instance, to 7c. Again, if I say something like doctor told the children to sleep until the evening, this sentence is appropriate only in such situation where the children are not sleeping yet, right? Where they're still awake and where they can actually sort of get this message and interpret it. And in addition to this, we can also demonstrate that this DP dative, for example, it does not pass idiom chunk tests, right? Which is also commonly used to distinguish between, let's say, control and raising. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show you the examples, but I have them in the appendix. So to summarize this very quickly, we have two DP datives, right? The first one is just a matrix goal of communication. We have support for that. And the second one is, on the one hand, related to the non-finite clause. So they form a unit together. But on the other hand, it cannot be analyzed as an argument of the embedded predicate itself. So the raising analysis, or let's say an ECM type analysis, are all excluded. So it looks like we have some kind of intermediate head that connects the two, that connect the DP dative and the embedded non-finite clause. And in the structure in 8, I denoted it as this X head. But I would like to further argue that this X here is in fact a C head of a particular type. And in Mari, it is manifested as this complementizer manin, or it's null allomorph. So we have the structure like the one in 9. When I say something like Masha as dative, Peter dative to come told, what we have here is the first DP dative, the blue one, being in the matrix clause, and the second DP dative, the greenish one, being merged initially in the spec of embedded CP. And then we have the C hat, and then we have this non-finite fin P in the complement position of this C hat in the embedded clause. So the complementizer manin can do two things at the same time. On the one hand, it selects this non-finite fin P as its complement. And on the other hand, it projects an argument in the specifier, the second dative DP. And it assigns the goal role to this argument. That's why this DP dative is restricted in the same way as all goals of communication are restricted in Mari. And this analysis can straightforwardly explain this correlation that only those predicates that can embed non-finite complement clauses with manin allow double dative. So let's say we have this predicate nelle, and please believe me, nelle is a control predicate. It can embed a non-finite clause. It can have this dative dependence. So I can say something like, for her father, it is hard to leave. Everything is fine. But I cannot use the complementizer manin in the embedded clause here. And I cannot use the second dative DP here. And under this analysis, when the two come together, live together, so to say, this would be straightforwardly explained. So let me now talk a little bit more about this complementizer manin, because after all, we don't see this quite often that a C hat can project an argument, right? So I would like to propose that the exceptional status of manin as a complementizer comes from a simple fact that it is a semi-grammaticalized element. So diachronically, manin is derived from the speech act verb manash, to say, to tell. And morphologically, it is actually identical to this either non-agreeing converb form or past tense third person singular form manin with the suffix And you can see here in 11 an example where mannen is still used as a lexical verb, alla virus, mannen chirurg, and the virus said the surgeon. So mannen here is clearly not a complementizer, it's just the main predicate. And mannen still retains some properties of lexical predicates. So for instance, similarly to lexical verbs, and unlike, for example, proper complementizers, which are usually borrowed from Russian, mannen always appears at the right edge of the embedded clause. So it cannot appear at the left edge of the embedded clause where those complementizers can be seen. And at this point, you may say that, well, why not to propose instead that mannen is not a C-head in these constructions? Maybe mannen is still a converb, right? Maybe it's still a lexical predicate. And what I'm actually saying when I say something like, Masha told us that Peter should come, I'm actually saying here something like, Masha told us something saying for Peter to come. So maybe this is actually a converbial construction, right? However, I want to show you some pieces of data that suggest that this is not the case, that mannen is indeed a proper C-head in the constructions under discussion and not a lexical verb. So first of all, converb clauses are usually adjuncts, and there is only one exception in Mari, and this is not it. And the embedded clauses with mannen under consideration are complements. Second, the morphological form of mannen in all these contexts is fixed. So for example, normally we can derive a negative converb from every other converbial form, but it cannot be done here in our situation. So if I try to say something like in 13b, let's say, Masha, you to go out of here told, using this negative form mande, right? This sentence is ungrammatical. It cannot be done here. In addition to this, we can show that mannen as a complementizer cannot be substituted by a converb form of a synonymous speech-act verb. So if this is just a lexical verb, right, then why can't we substitute it with a synonym? We have quite close synonyms like popash, for instance, or kutirash, which also can be translated as say or speak or tell. And when they're used as lexical verbs, they're quite interchangeable, so to say, but not in our case. And in addition to this, we can also show that mannen as a complementizer is desemanticized. So, okay, in our double dative constructions, we have the speech scenario, so to say, we have the speech flavor, right? But mannen can also be used in complement clauses that are embedded under mental and emotive predicates, such as believe or know or to be afraid, for instance. And it can also appear in adjunct purpose clauses where there is clearly no speech act semantics involved. So in general, I follow Toldova and Sertobolskaya in that in modern Mari, mannen is being grammaticalized as a functional element. And I would like to propose that we have currently at least 3 different entries for this one item. So on the one hand, we have this lexical form mannen, a converb of a lexical verb, right? On the other hand, we have this fully grammaticalized complementizer mannen that we see, for example, in adjunct purpose clauses. And in between, we still have this semi-grammaticalized element that on the one hand already functions as a C-head, as a functional element, but on the other hand, it still retains some of its lexical properties, namely the ability to assign this goal role to an argument, which is merged directly in spec CP. And you can see again the structure here in 15. And now I would like to pay a little bit more attention to the formal analysis of these constructions. So to analyze first monodative object control constructions, that is sentences with just one dative DP, right? I essentially adopt Landau's logophoric control analysis for attitude predicates and speech act verbs in Mari when they are used as these order predicates, they are attitudinal. We can show that. So here's in 16, you can see basically Landau's structure for such constructions. And what is important here is this GP component that we can see in the specifier of embedded CP. So the idea is that when you have this matrix attitude predicate and it embeds a CP, that CP is propositional. And at the left periphery of that propositional CP, we have the so-called concept generator phrase. And that phrase introduces the 4 discourse-related coordinates or variables for that embedded proposition: the author, the addressee, the time, and the world. And at least some of those coordinates can actually be syntactically projected. So when we have object control, we have this addressee coordinate being syntactically sort of realized at the left periphery of this embedded CP. And this little pro coordinate, on the one hand, it gets bound by what looks like the matrix controller, right? The matrix DP dative. And on the other hand, it establishes this predication relation with the embedded non-finite FinP. And that can be done because the FinP is not saturated. There is still this empty slot there. There is still this big pro variable. So we have these like 2 tiers, basically. On top of that, we have this variable binding between the controller and this little pro addressee discuss variable. And lower, we have this predication established between this little pro variable and this big pro embedded subject. And again, this is Landau's analysis. This is not an original proposal of mine. What I would like to propose now to use the very same basically structure to describe the properties of double dative sentences is to substitute this GP, right, with the second dative DP. So essentially what we do in double dative constructions, instead of realizing syntactically this discourse variable, the complementizer Manen can exceptionally introduce the second dative DP, the second goal of communication, if you want. And obviously we don't have variable binding here because the second DP dative is referential, but we still have this predication. So the DP dative and this big pro are connected via predication that is established. So the DP dative is basically the subject of this predication, and the embedded FinP is used as the predicate itself. And based on this analysis, we can make at least 2 predictions, and both of them are borne out, which is quite good. So if you take a look again at this structure, right? So first thing that we expect to see here is that, again, this FinP, in order to be suitable as a predicate, it must be not saturated, right? So there must be this empty slot there. There must be this big pro. And this predicts that embedded finite clauses should be incompatible with the second DP dative. And that's exactly what we see in Mari. So double datives are impossible with embedded finite clauses. And the second kind of prediction there is that, again, if you take a look at the 2 structures, right, we have variable binding in monodative object control constructions. And variable binding is quite flexible. So we expect partial control to be possible, to be available when we have only 1 DP dative. But at the same time, when we have 2 DP datives, we don't have this variable binding anymore, right? We only have this predication, and predication is much stricter. So we expect only exhaustive control to be possible when we have 2 dative DPs. And that's, again, exactly what we see in Mari. So let me show you a couple of examples. So we have here this together type modifier perla embedded in this non-finite clause. And it is possible to have this together type modifier with a singular controller in the matrix clause when we have only 1 dative DP. So Masha told you to live together. This is fine. This can be interpreted as, for instance, you and Masha should live together, or you and someone else should live together. This is a fine sentence. But if now I introduce here the second DP dative, then the sentence with the perla in the embedded clause and singular controller in the matrix clause becomes ungrammatical. So I cannot say Masha told me for you to live together with 2 DP datives. That would be impossible. And again, the proposed analysis can straightforwardly account for that. So to summarize and to make some concluding remarks here, hopefully I have demonstrated that spec CP first is not restricted to having above properties. And what's even more important, this PAC-CP position can be suitable not only for internal merge, but also for external merge. So an argument can actually be base generated there, and it can be licensed thematically by the embedded C head itself. And in Mari, this can be done because of those particular properties of this complementizer monin. It is a semi-grammaticalized element, and it retains still some of its lexical properties. And for future research, it would be really interesting to look, for example, at other languages where speech-act verbs are being grammaticalized into complementizers. I know about 2 such cases, but I haven't taken a look at them yet. So this is something that I would like to explore in the future. So for example, Chappell in her paper suggests that in Cantonese and in Hakka, we have those semi-complementizers as they're called. So maybe it is worth looking at them and see if they also have such mixed behavior, if they also behave partially as lexical predicates and partially as functional heads. In addition to this, as I said, I believe that in Mari, we have at least these 3 different lexical entries, right? So we have semi-grammaticalized complementizer monin that we see in speech act context. And we also have this fully grammaticalized monin that we see, for example, in embedded adjunct clauses. So the question is, well, how do we choose between them, right? What regulates their distribution? It would be really nice to account for that formally. And here, my suggestion would be to consider properties of matrix predicates and to focus more on the attitude, non-attitude distinction. And here, probably we could make this very nice parallel with, let's say, data from Korean and Japanese, because several recent papers suggested that there may be some correlation between the impossibility of ECM across the finite clause boundary in Korean and Japanese, and the, again, attitude, non-attitude properties of the main predicate, right? And you can see those works cited here, referred to here. And the final direction would be, of course, to examine in more detail the covert left periphery in Mari. It has been suggested in several papers already that at the left periphery of embedded and sometimes even main clauses, we have those speaker or addressee variables syntactically projected, or for example, special other discourse-oriented arguments. And usually what's interesting, they are separated from the CP, right? So we have CP first, and then we have those special projections for those special discourse-oriented arguments. And it would be really interesting to see if that is indeed necessary, or maybe we can actually sort of collapse all of those projections together into one. So thank you so much for your attention. I will stop here, and I will be very grateful for all commentaries and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question that I would like to ask, if I could. I can't remember the number of the examples, but there was in a section that you were talking about the syntax of this item as having the syntax of a complementizer.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that there are other constructions in this language in which the complementizer appears not on the right edge, but on the left edge. I was wondering, how do you analyze those types of constructions? Because wouldn't that lead you to think that this construction is not one that involves a complementizer if it's appearing on the right edge as opposed to the left edge? So I was wondering if you could please speak about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful question. So first, I must confess that I have to think more about this. My intuition would be that basically, I would say that those sentences should be analyzed in the same way as just having like embedded CP, right, and C hat, and the complementizer in the C hat. And the only distinction would be that we have the hat on the left and not on the right. And that could be probably explained by the fact that all of those other complementizers, not monin, they're all borrowed from Russian. And Russian is obviously a had initial language, while Mari is had final language. So maybe we can explain the difference by saying that, well, look, when you borrow complementizer, you borrow together with it like those structural properties. So that would be my answer.
I see, I see, I see.
And there are no other Mari complementizer.
Okay, okay, okay. Interesting, interesting. Okay. I had another question that I would like to ask, but let me first check the chat because I don't want to block anyone else if anyone has a question.
There are questions in the question answer.
Question and answer. Yes, what a great place to look for questions. Okay, let's take a look at this question from Elena Benedicto. The chat is saying two questions. If the second dative binds a pronoun in the embedded clause, is it you or is it him / her?
Thank you so much. That's again a very good question. So empirically, this would be him, her. So we don't have a lexical shift there. What's interesting, we do have a lexical shift in Mari in general, but not in these double dative constructions. So, and not with non-finite clauses. So if I remember correctly, we have indexical shift with embedded finite clauses occasionally being possible, but not in these double dative constructions.
Interesting. Okay, so they're distinct. So they're distinct. We have another question from Mark Baker. Do you associate some meaning with C as Manon to allow it to have a goal? So does it refer to an event? Can it go with force as a matrix verb?
So at this point, I really want to be very kind of tentative in my proposal, and I would like to say that Manon as a complementizer has almost lost all of its semantics, but I have to examine it much closer, of course. We may also suggest that Manon still retains some of its original speech semantics, and maybe it forms some kind of complex predicate, for example, together with this non-finite fin-p, right? And maybe this goal role is assigned jointly by this combination of Manon and the embedded fin-p. I don't have the answer right now to the last two questions, like does it refer to an event? Can it go with force and matrix verb? And to be honest, I don't have much intuition here at this point, but I will definitely think about it. Thank you.
So something to be looked at. I would like to give you the question that is posed by Elena Benedicto. So she says, this reminds me a lot of serial verb constructions with semi-grammaticalized verbs. If so, it may be that this property of introducing an argument is not properly a property of the C, but a property of some other feature of the head. As a complex head, say a modal. The meaning sounds very much like a modal.
Yes, if I may quickly share the screen back, because I do have, surprisingly, I do have something to say about this alternative modal analysis. So it's in the appendix, and I will try to share the link to the handout in this question answer chat as well. I apologize that didn't work. So an alternative analysis would be to suggest that we have this like modal, right? And that modal had this X here, for instance, it combines together the dative and the embedded CP, right? The only sort of objection I have against this analysis is that ideally we would like the silent modal to fit in, probably with other over-deontic modals that are available in Mari, because we wouldn't want to just stipulate, right, a completely different model out of the blue, basically.
Mhm.
And the overt models that we see in Mari, on the one hand, they are quite similar. So they can also embed a non-finite clause. They can also have a dative dependent, right? But on the other hand, they have some completely distinct properties. So for instance, they have not such a strict restriction. So for example, this deontic model, Kulash, which is basically to be necessary, it has this plus animate restriction on the DP dative and not a plus human one, right? So they can also embed finite subjunctive clauses, and that is completely prohibited in our double dative constructions. They also cannot embed non-finite clauses with manen, right? And again, manen is possible in our double dative constructions. So I think if we want to postulate such a structure, it would be possible, but it would involve too many stipulations, so to say.
Mhm.
And I just believe that the current proposal that I just showed you is a little bit more elegant, so to say.
Mhm. Mhm. Yes. Okay. Thank you. I think that we have time for one more question. We have a question from Haley. Hi, Kingong. Kingong. Could you talk more about dative markers in Mari? How many different forms are there? Are there allomorphs?
There is just one dative marker, that is lan, and to the best of my knowledge, it has no allomorphs. So I don't suspect that there is something fishy going on with the dative marker here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that that is just what it looks like, that is just the dative marker.
Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.
Our next speaker is going to be Daoxin Li. Daoxin is from the University of Pennsylvania, and she will be speaking with us on controlling overt subjects in Mandarin.
Hello. So thanks for being here. I will share my screen and I send the links to the slides in the chat. Okay, so today I'll be talking about the control construction with an overt control in Mandarin. One is the plan after class, he will go look. So the overt controls have been observed in other languages as well, but previous proposals diverge in whether to analyze them as lexicalized big pros or not. And today we'll present new evidence from Mandarin for non-big pro overt controls in finite control. And we also provide new perspectives for partial control theories. We'll show that there is a structural difference between exhaustive control and partial control, and that the partial reading in partial control arises from an associative morpheme. So here's the roadmap today. First, we'll introduce the background and show that the construction is indeed obligatory control. And then we will take a detour and argue that there is a structural difference between partial control and exhaustive control. And then we will provide evidence against a big pro analysis of overt control in Mandarin before we conclude and discuss the implications. So first, as in many other languages, there is a distinction between subject and object control, and also a distinction between partial and exhaustive control in Mandarin. So for partial control, the control E can include more reference than the controller. So when we have a singular controller, we can use a collective embedded word like gather, require a symmetrically plural subject, but this is not allowed in exhaustive control. And the same is true in object control. An example for partial control would be the word for urge, and an example for exhaustive control would be ask. Now, previous literature has argued that all the types of control verbs in Mandarin can control overt controlees. And those controlees could be pronouns or 自己, meaning self, or reflexives, which is a pronoun plus 自己, or complemented pronouns, that's a pronoun plus numeral. So as in for, it can be 李四 plan, he or self, or he self, or he one person go look. And it's been argued that the overt controlees are lexicalized big pros. But today we will argue that only partial control verbs allow overt controlees, and that the overt controlees are not lexicalized big pros. So now we will argue that the construction is obligatory control. And we will use 3 tests for obligatory control. So the first one is sloppy versus strict reading. Obligatory control only allows a sloppy reading in VP ellipsis. For example, in English, a pronoun allows both a sloppy reading and a strict reading. So in 5, Mary promised that she would behave, her father did too. The ellipsis could mean either her father promised that he would behave or Mary would behave. But for a big pro in obligatory control, only a sloppy reading is allowed. So Mary promised to behave. And here the ellipsis can only mean her father promised that he would behave, not Mary would behave.
Mhm.
And now in Mandarin, for a non-control verb, hope, the overt subject allows both readings. So in I hope I or self after go this school study, my sister too, it can mean my sister also hopes she or I will go study in this school. But under the control verb plan, only the sloppy reading is possible. So it can only mean my sister plans to go study in the school, not she plans for me. And the same holds true for object control. I'm skipping the details here. The next test is daisy versus dairy reading. So a pronoun allows both readings, but a big pro only allows a daisy reading. Now in this scenario where John is a candidate, he is watching himself giving a talk on TV, but he's too drunk to recognize himself, and he thinks the man on TV is a terrible candidate. If we use the pronoun as in 11, then both John hopes he will win and John hopes he will be defeated are true, because the pronoun can be either John or somebody else. But if we use the big pro, then only John hopes to win is true, because the big pro can only be John himself. And now in Mandarin, under the non-control verb hope, the subject allows both readings. Now in a scenario where Li Si is too drunk to recognize himself in the photo and thinks that's his son, and he hopes and plans for his son, but not for himself to go to college, then both Li Si hope he not will go attend college and Li Si hope he will go attend college are true, because the pronoun here can be either Li Si or his son. But under the control verb plan, then only Li Si plan he not will go attend college is true. So this suggests the pronoun here can only be Li Si, not his son. And again, is true for object control. And the third test is long distance control, which is not allowed in obligatory control. So in the non-control construction in 17, John knows that Bill said he will come. He could be either Bill or John. But in the control construction in 18, John knows that Bill promised to come. The big pro can only be Bill, not the long distance John. Now in Mandarin, the non-control verb say allows long distance co-reference. So in 19, Jiang San no, Li Si say he will go travel. The he could be either Li Si or Jiang San. But under the control verb, Jiang San no, Li Si plan he will travel. The pronoun can only be Li Si, not the long distance Jiang San. And again, the same holds true for object control. So overall, here we argue that overt subjects embedded under control verbs are obligatorily controlled and is different from overt subjects embedded under non-control verbs. So in other words, the construction we're dealing with is indeed control, although there is an overt embedded subject. So now we will argue that there is a structural difference between partial and exhaustive control. The first observation supporting the argument is only partial control verbs allow overt control ease. And although previous work reported overt control ease for exhaustive control verbs as well, we will show that those are actually adverbs, since 自己, reflexives, and complemented pronouns have both a pronominal use and an adverbial use, meaning by oneself. And now we will use 4 tests to show that those elements are only adverbs under exhaustive control verbs. And the first test is the focus markers, even also. They can be used to stress an argument in between, but not an adverb. So even Lily also go casino is grammatical, but Lily, even she one person or self also go casino is bad.
Mhm.
Now in control, those focus markers can be used with those elements under a partial control verb. So dad and mom plan evening, even they too or they self also go casino is grammatical, suggesting those elements are in the piece here. But under the easy verb try, this sentence is ungrammatical. So this indicates those elements here are only verbs under the exhaustive control verb. And the second test is the modal will. So a subject appears before the modal and an adverb appears after it. So Jiang San will, he one person or himself go is grammatical, but Jiang he one person or himself will go is ungrammatical when we want to say Jiang go by himself. And now for partial control verbs, the overt embedded subjects can appear before the modal. So Lisa plan, he, one person, or self will, early finished report is grammatical, suggesting those elements are DPs here. But for exhaustive verbs, those elements cannot appear before the modal. So Lisa try, he, one person, or self will, early finished report is bad, again suggesting those elements are adverbs here. And it's same for object control again. The third test is high adverbs. So there are some adverbs that must appear after the subject and before a modal or adverbs, if any, such as the word meaning also. So in this example, Zhang San will self or one person go France travel. Li Si will self or one person go. Here, if you want to use the word, it must appear here immediately after the subject. Now for partial control verbs, the overt embedded subjects can appear before those high adverbs. So this self also go is grammatical, but is ungrammatical under exhaustive control verbs. So this try self also go is bad. And again, this is true for object control. And now the fourth test is pronouns. So a pronoun does not have an adverbial use, and it turned out that they can be embedded under a partial control verb, but not under an exhaustive control verb. So this plan next summer he go travel is good, but this try next summer he go travel is bad, and is true for object control too. So to sum up, we show that 自己, reflexives, and complemented pronouns behave as an adverb under control verbs, but can behave as an DP under partial control verbs. So this indicates that only partial control verbs allow overt control ease. Now, the second argument for a structural difference between partial and exhaustive control is the future morpheme 将 can only appear under partial control verbs. So this is a syntactic future morpheme that is to be distinguished from auxiliaries or adverbs. And the crucial part is it can appear under a partial control verb, as in 38, Lisa plan, he will, today finish report, but it cannot appear under an easy verb. So in 39, Lisa try will be today finish report is bad. So why is this? A possible answer could be maybe there's no TP projection under exhaustive control verbs, since it has been demonstrated that exhaustive control verbs can take VP complements. But we will show this is not the answer, and we'll use two tests to show that exhaustive control verbs allow sentential complements. So the first test involves the morpheme 说, which appears at the left periphery of an embedded clause. As in 40, 李是 know the marker this book Johnson read. And it turned out that the marker can appear under exhaustive control verbs. It's grammatical to say 李是 try the marker also go France travel, suggesting that the verb can take a sentential complement. And the next test is ex-situ focus is in CP. This is true either generally or for the kind of what matter focus in Mandarin. So this is moved from the object position, and it can appear under exhaustive control verbs. It's grammatical to say 李是 try what matter all self-handle, meaning 李是 tries to handle everything by himself. So overall, we show that the exhaustive control verbs can take sentential complements. So this means the morpheme 将 is inhibited under exhaustive control verbs for other reasons than a lack of TP projection. And we attributed this to finiteness. That is, the complement of exhaustive control verbs is non-finite, but 将 is a finite morpheme. So in this section, we argued that there is a finiteness distinction between partial control and exhaustive control complement. And only partial control verbs can take a finite complement. And it also explains why only partial control verbs allow overt controlees. And now we will show evidence against a big pro analysis of overt controlees in Mandarin. The first piece of evidence is, as we have just seen, only partial control verbs allow overt controlees. And this is not predicted by a big pro analysis of overt controlees, since big pros can appear under both partial control verbs and exhaustive control verbs. And the second observation is the overt controlees retain their own syntactic and semantic properties under control. So one example is the exhaustive versus partial reading. In non-control constructions, the pronouns and reflexives allow a partial reading by attaching the morpheme men. So in A, it's grammatical in Mandarin to say, I saw ourselves by attaching the morpheme to the pronoun. But if we use the word 自己, then it's just ungrammatical to attach the morpheme here, and the sentence can only mean I saw myself, not I saw ourselves. This morpheme is an associative plural marker in Mandarin. It maps a kind to a salient group in the context, and it cannot be attached to 自己 because of semantic type mismatch. And now this property about attaching the morpheme and gaining a partial reading is returned under control. So in this example, this plan will go travel if we use the pronoun as the subject. If we do not attach the morpheme, then we have an exhaustive reading. But we also can attach the morpheme, and now we have a partial reading. But if we use the word 自己, then just as in non-control constructions, we cannot attach the morpheme, and consequently, we do not have a partial reading. So this suggests those subject elements are different from each other and then not just uniformly lexicalize the big pros. And this fact supports the associative morpheme approach to partial reading. It's argued that the partial reading in partial control arises from an associative morpheme that is attached to the control E. So it gives us the plural entity that includes X and is associated with X in the specific context. And this is just what the morpheme men does. It's just this morpheme is invisible in languages like English, but it's visible in Mandarin. And another example is from logoricity. So in non-control constructions, 自己 is a logopher, and it can only be bound to an object that is set as the logophoric center. So in A, Zhang San tell Li Si, one will criticize himself or self. So here the reflexive can be bound by all the three arguments, but the object Li Si is not a logophoric center here, so the logopher 自己 cannot be bound by the object. But if we deliberately make the object the logophoric center by saying there's something that made Li Si very sad, then now both the reflexive and the logopher can be bound by the object. And again, this property is returned under control. So when the object is not set as the logophoric center, the word 自己 cannot be bound by it. And thus it cannot serve as the overt controllee in object control. So in A, Jiang San urged Li Si, if others all not go, himself also will not go. Here, the reflexive can be bound by the object, so it's good. It can be the overt controllee, but because this is still control construction under urge, then the reflexive cannot be bound by this long distance subject. But for the word 自己, it cannot be bound by this object that is not the logophoric center, so it's ungrammatical to use it as the overt controllee here. But again, if we deliberately make the object our logophoric center by saying there's something that made this very sad, then now this word 自己 can be bound by the object. And so it's grammatical to use it as the overt controllee here. So this suggests the word is still a logopher when it's controlled. It's not a lexical like the big pro. So to summarize, in this section, we show that overt controllees keep their own syntactic and semantic properties when controlled, except for the bound reading enforced by the control construction. So this suggests overt controllees in Mandarin are non-big pro elements, only licensed in the finite complement of partial control verbs. Now, to conclude, here are our major arguments. So firstly, only partial control verbs can take finite complements and thus license overt controllees. And secondly, overt controllees in Mandarin are not overt forms of big pro. And thirdly, the partial reading arises from an associative morpheme. So those findings extend obligatory control theories beyond big pros, since we show that other elements can also be controlled. And we support a structural difference between partial control and exhaustive control and provide independent evidence for the associative morpheme approach to partial control while arguing against a purely commutative approach to partial control. So this is our presentation, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. Very, very interesting data. And I think that we have time for one question. We have a question in the question and answer. So from Matthew Fulton, could you please say more about the distinction between the Yao and Jiang future morphemes? Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very, very good question. So although the both morphemes have been glossed as will about the future time, they are quite different in their nature. So the Yao has been treated as a modal, or in other words, an auxiliary, and it has passed the test for auxiliaries that, for example, it can appear in a not a constructions or in negations like not will. And it can appear under both partial control and exhaustive control verbs, as we have seen. But Jiang is different. So it's different from all the other auxiliaries in that it can co-occur with other auxiliaries, but it has to appear before those other auxiliaries if there are any. That is, must take a structurally higher position than all of them. And also it does not pass the standard tests for auxiliaries such as a not a or negation. So that's why it has been proposed to be a finite morpheme.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. I'm afraid that we have utilized all of our time, but I want to thank both of our presenters and thank you to our audience for very interesting questions. We will close the session now. Thank you.
Thank you.